we are going to invite Tim up onto the virtual stage here. Tim, so I was reading about you, and you are the father of serverless technology. I don't know. I was just like, I want to dive in more about like like all of the different areas that you've created and you've done. But basically, I feel like you've helped birth the cloud world. So really excited for your talk today, and that now you're bringing your expertise of creating or helping to launch the cloud revolution, and now you're helping to launch the Web3 revolution, right? So really excited to have you here today and to have your presentation. So again, the same format, you'll have the stage for 35 minutes to if you want to share more about your background and let people know about your fun journey. And then we'll also open up for about 10 minutes of Q&A. For your talk, I will go through the chat channel, and I'll just then be reading them to you, to the questions, because that might be easier for you. So, and so with that, I'll hand over the stage to you, Tim.
Awesome. That sounds great. Let me get us going here. And are you able to hear me okay and see the screen all right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Fantastic. All righty. So, I called this cloudy with a chance of blockchain. So we'll see what all that means here in a second. But first, a little bit about me. So, you mentioned some of my background here. I spent a lot of time in the cloud. So I was employee one on what eventually became AWS Lambda, kind of long before we even had the word serverless there. And then went on to run that and several of the other services at AWS. So, I've done a lot here in terms of building these really large, hyperscale, multi-tenanted data planes and services out in the cloud. And part of the goal there, part of what made me passionate about that was this idea of simplicity, like actually making the cloud usable for mere mortals. And then I went down to San Francisco, spent some time at Coinbase as the VP of engineering. I was really excited about crypto ecosystems. And so that was a chance to kind of get, up close and personal with a bunch of cryptocurrencies and with the process and the mechanisms by which they get turned into a real business. And one of the eye-opening things is the actual crypto part of a company like Coinbase is actually like this tiny little percentage of the code base. I mean, it's interesting because you think of it as a crypto company, and yet a lot of what powers it, a lot of what makes it go, is a big centralized Ruby on Rails app, backed up by like MongoDB and other kind of classic centralized technologies. And so that was really interesting, seeing some of the limitations, if you will, of what it took to actually build that and turn that into a business beyond just the public chain itself. And so, I remain really excited about this idea of democratizing cloud and blockchain services, which, hopefully kind of is part of the philosophy that underpins, Web3. And it's part of what got me excited about Vendia. So here's a fun fact. 80% of business data lives outside a company's four walls. And that's really amazing because it kind of turns the whole conventional notion of IT on its head. Thanks to SaaS, globalization, automation, eventually every app is going to be facing some kind of cross-company data sharing challenge. And that's really interesting. It's kind of a fundamental shift in what IT applications are all about. My co-founder, Shruti Rao, and I created Vendia to really go after and address that challenge. Right? So what we build is what we offer is this B2B data sharing service, and generate APIs on top of it. It makes it really easy for companies, for organizations of all shapes and sizes to securely share real-time data. So they can build these applications that span partners, span companies, and span clouds, which we think are the way that people actually need to build. And I would say, contrary to what you might have read in the press, there are a ton of use cases out there for blockchain type technology. Each and every day, we're talking to enterprises, mid-market companies, and selling them real software for real money to build things like supply chains and financial settlements and other kinds of partner data buses of all shapes and sizes, even things like pet care information and and financial information. And so these use cases exist, but there's a catch. They only work, they're only interesting if that data sharing can be made simple, safe, cost-effective, and fast. It's got to be all those things, because if it's not all those things, it doesn't actually end up being super interesting for the enterprise. So that's a little about Vendia Share, but what we're going to actually talk about here today, and the piece that's actually interesting, is not so much what we do as a business, but how we do it. So it's kind of the inverse of what I normally try to do in talks. And instead of talking about the why, we're going to talk a little bit more here about the what, because that kind of reads directly on what kind of technology you build, how you think about the go-to-market, how you think about the product strategy, and how you shape for the technology IT infrastructure that's starting to emerge here. So, for example, Vendia Share is a private permissioned blockchain as a service. And kind of all those words sort of matter, right? You know, how we deliver it, what we build, and kind of what we style for consumption here. And underlying that is this very high throughput, low latency cloud data and file replication, right? All of it on chain. But that's the thing that customers ultimately need from us, the ability to move any kind of data of any shape in any size across any cloud to any partner. And then also things like being able to go from there to public chains and doing a bunch of other stuff like that ends up being important, although we're not going to talk all about all those details in this conversation here. So tons of more stuff on our blog if you're interested in all the how we do, what we do, et cetera. What I want to talk about here tonight is what we've learned talking to all those enterprise customers and building infrastructure for them that's got to span public clouds and different blockchains. Because that's the piece that's kind of really interesting. So look, you're all a bunch of Web3 developers, entrepreneurs, founders, investors. Web3 is super exciting. Also a little bit messy and also not exactly working in every possible way yet. But tons of exciting innovation, lots of business and technical ideas, and some parts of it, having worked at Coinbase, like real business, real IPO, making real money out there, have actually been monetized and commercialized very successfully. But like any up and coming thing, Web3 wants to rule the world, kind of wants to rule the whole world. And here's the thing, cloud's a thing, like pretty much everything. Like if you took the entire blockchain and crypto community, the increase in the size of the cloud on a single quarter over quarter growth is probably tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of times the entire blockchain and crypto ecosystem. So let's just like kind of soak that up for one sobering moment, just like the sheer ratio of what cloud is relative to everything else. So let's kind of cut to the chase here, right? And then we're going to go talk about kind of what the chase tells us. But first of all, let's kind of face this hard thing, right? Web3 is not going to kill the public cloud, right? Like that just isn't going to happen. Disruptive technologies almost always position themselves as antagonistic to what came before. And that's really common. I mean, look, the public cloud said for years that it was going to kill on-prem. Guess what? On-prem's bigger now than it has ever been at any point in the history of the world. So it didn't quite work out that way. In fact, what they turned out to be is an important set of complementary, often hybrid technologies that enterprises and companies often use together to get things done, right? And similarly, there was a lot of arguing about, public chains, private's bad, public's bad, whatever. It turns out that like there isn't a one size fits all replacement for an entire enterprise IT stack. It's too complicated, it's too big, and it's too heterogeneous. So like that isn't going to happen. So here's a much better question. How can we take this classic world of centralized IT, public cloud, private chains, and public chains and get them to work together for some kind of interesting set of outcomes? And oh, by the way, since like all of us here are interested in, in kind of startups and companies, how can we actually make money out of that outcome? So let's talk a little bit about part of what underpins this, this statement. Throughput and replication are physically at odds. It's really difficult to take data, distribute that data broadly, replicate it to a lot of different places, spend a lot of network messages to ensure that that data has been synchronized, carefully ordered, and properly registered at all those different places, right? And because things like the speed of light get in the way. That takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy. And that replication comes at a cost. if you look at the number of bits moved around in public chains, a lot of what gets consumes actual cycle time or things like leader election, Byzantine attack resistance, DDoS resistance, consensus protocols, not actual data motion. And that's significant because the job of actually storing and replicating and executing all that code then becomes a law of physics, right? This is a law of physics that's not going to go away. So if you want something to be fast and cheap, you do it once behind the firewall on private software and hardware where it doesn't cost very much money to perform the action, store the result, or do the computation. So centralized IT and private chains can use the cloud, right? So multi-tenancy and economies of scale become available to them, but public chains, they're typically locked into these single box solutions, and there's only so much one machine can do. That's a really hard upper bound on performance. It's also a bit of an upper bound on development processes, because you know what's actually slow? Getting miners, open source developers, node operators, clients, like all those people to agree what to do next with Ethereum. That's challenging. You know what's fast? Getting one developer to change one database for one company in some way that they already understand. So the more people that you need to do something, right, and the more replication you need, the more sort of just the reality of either physics or human nature tends to get in the way there. So let's talk a little bit about what these individual technologies are super good at, right? And then we can start to think a little bit about how do we plug them together to do something really interesting. I'll start with public chains. They are amazing for planet-wide distribution of small amounts of data. Now, the bad news, that data, getting that data everywhere and getting it consistent is typically slow, pricey, and if it's still using proof of work, kind of horrifyingly bad for the environment. But it's really, really good at creating that massive public record of something that can be planet-wide agreed upon. Private chains excel at controlled data sharing, like lots of data. Access controls, role-based controls, limited distribution, like they're ideal technology platforms for constructing partner data buses. But they're not good at global spanning systems of record like public chains. And then centralized AT, like especially behind a firewall, is always going to be the fastest, cheapest, and therefore arguably best way to implement any technology solution that doesn't require broader sharing, right? It's just sort of the physics of the equation. So let's think about how we put these puzzle pieces together, right? Now, what would better together actually look like in a real world example? So in the process of making this deck, I had to download some images, right? So I wanted to make sure that they're properly licensed, kind of do my proper diligence here. I want to make sure you're seeing things I'm allowed to show. So I went to Adobe Stock to purchase some images, right? Adobe Stock is an old school media licensing, digital asset management platform, right? And they do things the old fashioned way. So some artist creates a digital asset. They turn around and sell that to some kind of distributor or media aggregator, like we're going to call them Acme. Acme then resells that to Adobe Stock. And then eventually I walk up to the Adobe Stock website and pick some cool little images that I'm going to use into this, use for constructing this deck, right? Great business. I'm sure Adobe makes a lot of money off that, right? It works like a charm. Except it's kind of missing some key capabilities that would be sort of nice. Like, for example, how does that artist actually know they're getting paid the right royalties? And, for that matter, like I'm as the licensee, like how do I know Adobe's actually empowered to give me that work in the first place? And then if you're Acme in the middle, you've kind of got problems coming and going. Like, how do you know whether your royalty distributions are accurate? How do you know if Adobe is distributing the right content? What if you needed to update that content? And then there's a question of third-party auditing. Like, suppose that one of you wanted to be sure that the images in my work, in my slide here tonight are actually legitimately licensed, right? And that the artist is being paid appropriately for them. Well, here's the problem. The answer to that question and all the rest of these, they're locked up in some private database that only Adobe can see. So the technology choice here of centralized IT is kind of reduced the spectrum of what we can kind of hope to get out of this, at least without simply trusting Adobe to have the right information or go build a bunch of additional infrastructure. So let's see if a public chain can fix all of this, right? We're all Web3 folks, right? So we're thinking, okay, that old centralized approach, that's so 2016. Let's just use NFTs instead. So some artist is going to create an asset. We're going to basically create a digital twin by turning that into an NFT, maybe on OpenSea. And then, wait, how exactly does reselling work? And where does the license go? And for that matter, how do we track the royalties and pay them again? And well, what about auditing the license usage? Because that's not really the NFT ownership, which wasn't really what it was designed for. So, kind of turns out that like NFTs as we know them today and sort of the public chain mechanism by itself doesn't exactly kind of cut it. Like there are all these business challenges of putting back in place all the things that something like Adobe Stock can get right at the moment, like just the basic reselling and licensing and tracking. So we really need more like a sequence of contracts. And unfortunately, these problems aren't just the business challenges. These problems kind of run deeper. You know, we've got these structural challenges, kind of like Coinbase, you know, the very services that make crypto usable kind of then rely on a bunch of conventional centralized IT technologies, like use OpenSea and Alchemy, and you're depending on a bunch of conventional databases, web services, you know, public cloud servers and so forth. So any of those things go down, you know, you're kind of out of luck. And you can't really put media assets on a public chain like Ethereum, at least not directly. So unfortunately here, most of what actually matters is off-chain by construction, which doesn't sound quite right for a public chain. And then, you know, what about low-cost items? Like, what if an image is going to be worth like $1? Well, we can't like spend 50 bucks on ETH gas to pay for that. That's not going to work. Not really a very good margin. And then, of course, there are a whole host of just technical problems. And you could argue, well, maybe some of these will go away, but things like not having access controls and distribution mechanisms, you know, like cloud level distribution built into a public chain is sort of what underpins something like Adobe Stock. So without all that capability, you know, we've got a challenge trying to recreate even the most fundamental basis of that business. So what if we let ourselves actually use best of breed solutions? What if we could combine the three different approaches here to build something that would actually optimize for each type of technology? So let's see how that might look. You know, we can still start the same way with the artist uploading some stuff to Acme Images. But now, in addition to maybe we'll leave the upload and the website management conventional, but we want to go place that information in the form of an NFT. So now we can say, you know, Acme owns this, and also place some information about the original artist there, along with their royalty agreement, right? So now we're kind of doing a little bit better here because we have a public expression of this. We can then step in and use a private chain to handle this reselling part. Right, this is going to be a large collection of assets that we want careful, controlled distribution with a small population. We don't want to put these media assets all out onto the public chain because there's no point. In fact, we wouldn't want that to happen. We don't want to share the media themselves with everyone. But instead, what we want to do here is share those media assets on chain just between the reseller and the original owner and Acme here. So now what we can do on the public chain is we can place the reselling contract. So we have the metadata about the relationship between Acme and Adobe. Now I come along. So, you know, someone like me enters the picture, browses Adobe's catalog, right? And now I can pick something that I like for this deck. And oh, by the way, Adobe doesn't even necessarily have to hold the assets. They can simply tell Acme Media to immediately transmit that asset directly to me, you know, through the power of CDN and access control integration. Meanwhile, Adobe also put some information on the public chain saying that now I, as a user, Tim Wagner, have rights to use this media, which is important because now any third party can come along and they have this amazing chain of custody like record keeping that's out there in the public chain that lets them audit things like the fact that I've got the right to use this work of art, Adobe had the right to license it to me in the first place, courtesy of the reselling contract. Acme Media is the owner of record, and the appropriate royalties are accruing to the original artist. Insert various new caveats about like who decides to disclose what to whom, But the nice thing is the chain of all of that can now be out there in a public world where anyone can see that, where it becomes a matter of indelible record. And the media still gets to be transitioned in ways that make sense from kind of a sharing and cost perspective. And that cost perspective is important here because now we've achieved low per transaction costs. We can group those public chain updates together. We don't need them to be independent. So we can make the gas actually amortize over a large number of transactions. And we've recreated all the original functionality of Adobe Stock. And we made that reselling process easier and more SaaS-like. And we solved all those open issues that a conventional approach wasn't able to easily handle. So we got this really nice effect now from actually combining all the different capabilities together. And this is sort of one of the things that we've had a lot of opportunity to reflect on at Vendia, because it's kind of becoming obvious that no one of these things alone is really a true substitute for the other. They really work best when we have a playbook and architecture for combining all of them together. But that also means we have to help enterprises and other companies understand what that playbook looks like and how they can actually turn that into meaningful, usable applications at the end of the day. So let's try and abstract our example into a little bit of architectural guidance here. Conventional, AKA centralized IT solutions. They're going to increasingly be built in the cloud, often on top of managed cloud services like serverless things like Lambda. They're going to continue to offer the highest throughput, the lowest latency, and the easiest governance. They're the best place to locate private applications and data. If you've got some information, you run analytics or BI on it, and the target audience of that is going to be, your leadership team. That's a great application for centralized IT. Want to do conventional fiat billing like Stripe integration? Again, perfect use for conventional centralized IT. Doesn't really work as well to kind of move some of those things off and try to make higher cost margin, higher cost basis solutions that require unnecessary replication. Then you've got private or permissioned chains where they are just absolutely ideal for building partner buses. Right? They've got the advantage of innovating quickly because you don't need everyone on the planet to agree. You just need a few partners to agree. You can also deliver them in SaaS fashion, which means you get this ability to get multi-tenancy, economies of scale. You can place them in the cloud. And what's going to happen here over time is conventional things that look like data sharing solutions, public APIs, will shift from being dumb pipes, just simple endpoints, into being these fantastic distributed ledgers that offer automatic maintenance, cryptographically provable single source of truth for cross-company use cases. It's a really nice application of blockchain technology for building these things, including stuff like cross-party financial settlements, right? And that's where they're gonna excel. And then public chains, although they've got limited throughput, they've got this amazing ability to create this public record. And so anytime we need public disclosure, non-repudiation, total ordering, maybe there's a public data market for some reason, and then this archival type of storage like we were talking about for NFTs, where we want to be able to track and connect ownership, licensing, anything that looks like an important record over time, whether it's truly public or whether it's just information that needs to be shared or disclosed on an as-needed basis, but has to live out there in a form that is not repudiable. And of course, cryptocurrencies and other on-chain tokens are going to live here because that's the place that it makes the most sense for them. So if we could step forward 10 years in the future, right, and ask what did all this look like when the dust settled? We're still going to see, just like today, if you look around, you're going to find mainframes, you're going to find on-prem data centers, right? You're still going to find people using a lot of conventional, aka, in this case, probably cloud IT, because of that kind of cost and price, cost basis thinking. It's going to still be the case that the foundational layer, whether it's SMB, mid-market, or enterprise IT, this is going to be the rational choice for projects and components where that sharing isn't like the critical piece of the equation. Private or permission blockchains in the form of these partner data sharing buses, they're going to come to represent like 15 to 20% of IT stacks. Things that look like public APIs today, like data sharing agreements, SPRF files if you're in the airline industry, secure FTP transmissions, EDI, all that stuff that looks like business to business data and all the challenges of making that consistent and correct across different partners, that's going to transition into these private blockchain spaces where the population, the sharing, and the access controls and governance can be really tightly managed, where that's actually probably the key determining factor. Public chains are going to be the smallest of the three here, but they play this critical role that none of the other two can actually substitute for. Because anytime you need this public chain of information, right, it's going to end up being often hashed or digested or in some other way summarized. But when you want that, it becomes the only plausible way to do it. And so at the end of the day, like that becomes, a critical piece, but not a large piece by percentage of code. And like I said, if you kind of looked into a company like Coinbase, it's kind of like what you would see in terms of the public chain relationship to more conventional IT software as a ratio. So kind of like summing things up here, public cloud's here to stay, right? It doesn't make sense not to embrace that as, as a likely outcome, and instead to think about what does the Web3 cloud actually look like, and how can it actually exploit, enhance, and integrate with the public cloud. Things like Ethereum, they're never going to be as fast or as cheap as we would like, and they're just never going to make a perfect operational data store. The idea of replacing a public cloud database like Amazon DynamoDB with Ethereum is about 15 orders of magnitude price performance ratio off today. That's 15 zeros. That's not going to be closed by switching to proof of stake or getting rid of a network call here or there. That's just too far apart. So we're going to have to think about architectures that exploit public chains and their technologies in the way that they're more likely to work, and understand what those limitations are likely to be, and then code around that. And you know what? Companies aren't going to care about any of our blockchain religions. They all are going to want fast time to market at low prices, and that's never going to change. So they're always going to feel pragmatic about their choice of architecture. And the things that are going to end up winning in the market are the ones that deliver on fast, because fast never goes out of style. So for an enterprise buyer or a startup founder, leveraging existing platforms for what they do best, it's always going to be the fastest way to build and fastest way to deliver. So for anyone who's interested in our platform, you can check us out at share.vendia.net. And if you're interested in this topic that I've been speaking about here today, what we somewhat amusingly refer to as the three-body problem, we have kind of a much longer white paper that kind of talks a little more about this in detail, has some additional examples, and explores the topic more fully up on our website today. So thanks so much for listening. And then I'm going to switch out of share mode here and be happy to take some questions and chat about it with everybody live.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And because we have, everyone here, I will actually just call on people to ask their own questions so they can also introduce themselves and get to say hi to you personally. So with the first one, awesome. I'll invite Jeremy up to unmute and ask your question to Tim.
Hey, Tim.
Hey there.
Thanks for your talk. I think you covered this a little later in the talk, but it might be nice to kind of dive in a little more. Can you expound on what it means to have a private chain? I think when you hear that, you can wonder, is that like a centralized transaction log that one entity controls? Is it a set of folks who maybe don't trust each other, but they know that only that group of folks has access to that chain? And how in that world do you go about managing that private chain?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, and obviously like people can have different definitions of this. And I'll tell you how we define it at Vendia. Mutual trustlessness between partners. So, if you and I are two different businesses, I'm not necessarily going to, trust you or vice versa. And we also kind of use this word trust somewhat loosely to also mean lack of operational dependence, right? Or maybe to flip it around in a positive light, isolation between operational systems. So one of the things we actually have customers doing is sometimes they'll stand up, with what we would think of at the end of the day as a private chain for themselves across two different clouds or two different regions. because it's a way to create operational isolation and independence. And so that's not a very Web3 kind of topic, right? But if you think about kind of public cloud and some of the things that sit behind making the cloud resilient and fault tolerant, those topics become really interesting and important to our enterprise customers. And then, in our case, one of the things that's really important too is that customers keep control of their data. And this is one of the things I think underlies a lot of like the private and permission chain discussion, is that the first thing every customer will ask me is, can I share the data I want with my partners? And then the second thing they'll always ask me is, can I ensure that I don't share the data if I don't want to? Right. And so that runs a little bit contrary to kind of typical, public chain thinking, where the idea is to get everything the same everywhere all the time. In a private chain, one of the hallmarks of it is that there's often asymmetric data sharing, right? You take a simple example drawn from the airline industry for us. If you're, United Airlines, you might want to share pricing or travel information with the FAA, right, as an auditor, with maybe with a company who does your financial systems, but you don't want to share it with American or Southwest and vice versa. So we spend a lot of time helping customers understand how to use access controls, authentication and authorization, all these things that at the end of the day are designed to let them get very fine-grained surgical control over who sees what and when within the chain. And I think that's obviously a little bit kind of definitionally different from what a public chain is typically trying to do.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Tim. And so, Bobo, it looks like you're up next.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think I'm using somebody else's ID, but nonetheless, my name is Himanshu. Thanks a lot for the chat. I am trying to understand, I saw that Azure has had a blockchain service, or it looked into it for the last 5 years. AWS may have been as well. I'm trying to understand from you, things like these, private ledgers, like two-party or multi-party, or the overall architecture that you were showing, hasn't really come to life, although they've been looking into it for as long. I'm trying to understand what might be some barriers, like blockchain or blockchain-based technologies, have come in waves, and kind of I think we had a winter, and now we are in the spring or the summer for this. I'm trying to understand what's going on.
Yep. Well, we could have a whole. I think I did an article once about the Gartner hype wave of blockchain. Look, here's the sort of the analogy that I give for this. Then we can talk a little bit about kind of adoption and kind of market penetration answers. So, first, what's the difference here? If you look at Amazon's managed blockchain or Azure's kind of equivalent, I would liken that distinction probably to say EC2 versus Lambda. There's they are very relatively thin veneers. They're a little bit more than machine images of Hyperledger Fabric, but not much. So they're relatively difficult to manage. They don't necessarily provide solutions like fault tolerance. They don't have a lot of built-in, maintenance or management capability. They're just kind of like one click above. Here's a deployment image. Go deploy it, and then good luck. So what we do is, again, just following this little analogy, since I happen to know it, is more like Lambda, right? It's something that is offered as a SaaS service. Customers walk up to us with a data model, in our case, a JSON schema, and then a few minutes later, they have a running chain in the cloud. They don't have to know how it happened. They don't have to stand up a machine. They don't worry about kind of keeping it running at the end of the day. And that distinction turns out to have the same effect that Lambda did versus EC2. You get a whole bunch of people who maybe didn't know how to build a distributed fault tolerant system out of little Lego blocks, but they sure as hell know how to take some Python code and hand it over and get it to run in the cloud. And so you dramatically expand the audience that you can suddenly have with that. So one of the things I would argue is that we've made a little mini cottage industry out of replacing failed blockchain experiments. I have a number of customers who have tried, often some flavor of Hyperledger Fabric. When they say blockchain, they don't mean Ethereum generally. They usually mean HLF. And we kind of come in and help them kind of build something that's usually simpler, more cost following. It's strongly typed versus dynamically typed. It gives them an SDK, right, that they actually has their own types in it that they can use in React. And all those things get them that much closer into a solution. So, I would say this is kind of part of what has held blockchain technology back, is more than just packaging. Like, it has to be easy to use. And unfortunately, some of that has to be solved at the platform level. If you could fix it with an IDE plugin, I mean, I think that would have happened. So it's, I would argue here, it's too much of that is a server-side challenge. And it's one of the reasons that, again, not just to focus on Vendia, but like we didn't just wrap Hyperledger Fabric to try to make it, simpler with some tools or UI. Like, we went back to the drawing board and, built our own, implementation from the ground up, precisely so we could do some of these things in a way that was, simpler, SaaS delivered, right, highly fault tolerant and scalable without the user ever having to lift a finger on it. And that, just turns out to widen the aperture a lot in terms of what you can build. The dirty little secret of enterprises is they may have money all up, but any given project you look at, it's like talking to a startup. They never have enough people, they never have enough time, and they never have enough money. So reducing time to market, even for a company like BMW, or United Airlines, turns out to be super critical. And, some of those cloud offerings, like in their first generation, just did not compress that, that adoption and production cycle enough.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And then Dylan, you're up next.
Hello. I think it was sort of answered from Jeremy's question. It was sort of, what is the private chain stack deployment look like? And it sounds like, at least for you, it's really a private blockchain as a service that you're providing to people, and then that means that you're managing features or version updates or that. Would that be how to think about it?
Yeah, exactly. And look, this is the stuff in the middle here is the has the most variety, right? Like, a lot of public chains are kind of similar in the way that they work, right? Is, you deploy them to a machine, they form a consensus network, et cetera. The centralized IT, right, has has kind of classic deployment things, but the way in which private chains can work has this huge spread, right? Everything from sort of the way like Hyperledger Fabric works as a, almost as a machine image, to these kind of semi-managed versions of it. We've gone all the way to the end of the continuum to make it as SaaS-like as possible. And that was partly, in our case, now I'm leaving behind kind of technology here and just talking about business. Like, it was a business choice, because we get more commercial success from customers who want, kind of zero operational and deployment footprint versus those who, want to kind of own and manage and operate that themselves. So for us, the split looks like, we will curate, updates to the system, and then we'll deploy these to individual private chains, and those chains have control over, when and how they want to take those updates. And then under the covers, it's kind of a whole discussion in its own right, we have time to go into. They also have to agree amongst themselves to the various kind of pieces of that update, to the changes to the system. And then those changes themselves, sort of the metadata, comes on chain as well, so that there's an audit and tracing record that talks about how things changed over time for either the deployment or this data schema, in addition to the actual data ledger itself. And that's going to be, a critical piece, so you get this complete chain from start to finish of everything that could have affected an outcome, or altered sort of altered the future reality of that system. And that's how we kind of split the difference between wanting to make it as easy and hands-off as possible from a management and ops perspective, while still making it something that is controlled and kind of consortium voted from the perspective of the people who are actually in any given chain at any given time. And then there's a whole kind of separate dimension here of topology changes and how you think about data ownership over time, which there's a lot there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Mayor, you're up next.
Hi, team. Great talk. So I'm curious to know your thoughts about like Polkadot substrate or Octopus network, which are like assuming like a blockchain of blockchains and multi-chain future. What does the tech stack looks like?
Yeah, I love some of those ideas, because I also think that one of the things that has to work for public chains here, right, is this idea that they are, and one of the things they're ultimately going to have to own in the technology stack is this this kind of currency exchange challenge, right? Like you're going to have, I mean, let's face it, you're going to have all the same migration and evolution challenges in a Web3 world that you had in a public cloud world, which all came from a private world, right? Like you can't get away from the fundamental structure and challenges there. So if I have a bunch of stuff on ETH, whether it's contracts or currency, right? I'm going to have some way, if I want to go use another chain, to ultimately kind of either extract it or share it or exchange it or whatever you have. And so this idea of on-chain exchanges and also just kind of compatibility and interconnectivity of public chains, I think becomes super important precisely because of that role that they play. And again, like the fact that I think they're a small percentage code-wise doesn't mean I think they're a small percentage, in terms of, say, things like currency holdings. I think over time, you end up with things like stable coins actually replacing a lot of fiat, currencies. And then, at a slightly longer, kind of time frame, I think you see cryptocurrencies, doing some of that. Today, volatility makes that hard, right? But over time, I mean, one of the things we've thought a lot about is, should we even embed a stable USDC or Tether, just so that customers can easily kind of hold billing and currency stuff on chain, with us, not because we need or want to be a cryptocurrency, but just to make payment and billing simpler in that mechanism. So I wouldn't talk too much about that here, but I think that is a big piece of it, as you mentioned, like public chain, especially intercompatibility, whereas private chains mostly worry about the data piece. Like the big challenge at that layer of the stack is going to be less about, say, currency and exchange and compatibility, and more about things like language compatibility, because not everyone wants to program in the same language in a smart contract, and data and media compatibility. Like one of the things I've got to struggle with at Vendia is I need to be able to store and share something as small as a single bit or as big as a 5 terabyte file, and I have to have that entire thing be on chain no matter what it is. And that's challenging, right? That's a challenge that the public chains have largely gotten to avoid, right? And it doesn't come up in the same way in a conventional centralized IT solution, but in a private chain, that's where the hard problem is there. So there's a piece of this we didn't delve into too much, which is, what are the hard problems that can only get solved in each of these areas, and then how do they go about addressing them? And I would say, like, media distribution and sharing is one that sits in the private and partner network space. These intertoken conversions and exchanges sit in the public space. And then obviously good old fashioned just cost control sits in the centralized IT, because at the end of the day, that one really is about shaving dollars off wherever you can. But it's a great question.
Awesome, Tim. So we are done with the questioning section. Radhima, are you still with us? I see you might be. I'm going to give you 2 seconds to see if I can get you on camera. 1, 2. Okay. She just might be busy. But do you have any final thoughts, Tim, for our community? Again, we have Web3 developers. They're building up their startups. They're going to be pitching on Sunday. We would love to have you, come and see their pitches. But any thoughts that you want to leave this community with as they embark on their building of their startups?
I just want to send a note of encouragement and support to everybody. Not just as a founder, but as a longtime builder, this stuff is so amazing, right? It's another one of these incredible moments in the, in sort of the technology industry where things are changing, and anytime things change and disrupt, there's this incredible opportunity for success. Let's face it, for making money and certainly for serving customers in new and interesting ways. And, I wake up every day excited and just loving my job. I'm so passionate about what I do. And I hope that, for all of you, this leads to, those same kind of outcomes. So, congrats to what you're doing and rock on. Good luck with all your projects.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. It's just been a huge pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. I think all of us can say, listening to you and Radhima, we could be here for hours. So we will give you back your evening. Thank you so much. And for our community, we will see you tomorrow. And so have a wonderful night and see you tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.